In 1875 to 1945, it is considered to be one of the saddest race-related times in American history. I will be telling the story of this racial and sorrowful period of time. At the start of World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, permitting the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans and over 8,000 to the 442nd Battalion due to racial discrimination. Fred Korematsu was one of the few people who spoke out against America's mistake. He took his case to the Supreme Court only to be arrested and put in an internment camp. Korematsu's case paved the way for the liquidation of the War Relocation Authority and over $38 million in reparations. However, there are not enough apologies or reparations America could give to cure the psychological and dehumanizing effects these people went through. In the 1930s, America was drastically hit by the economic crash better known as the Great Depression. This had a snowball effect since the U.S. was supplying Japan with oil, various metals, and other supplies to keep the military thriving. This caused Japan to have a financial crisis due to illegal bank loans known better as the Showa financial crisis. This country was already hurting from World War I and never recovered financially. On September 18, 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria for another source of raw materials. America was furious with this decision. On August 1, 1941, they placed an embargo on Japan of various metals, but most importantly, oil. In a fit of rage, on December 7, 1941, Japan bombed a naval base located in Pearl Harbor. This was laying groundwork for one of America's greatest mistakes. Toyosaburo Korematsu, better known as Fred Korematsu, was born on January 30, 1919, in Oakland, California. His father had immigrated to America in 1904 and settled in San Francisco. His mother immigrated 9 years later. Fred was the second youngest out of his 4 brothers. He was not the ideal son his parents had wanted. He would have rather been watching sports or listening to music than helping in his parents' plant nursery. Begrudgingly, he still did everything to help his parents out. As Korematsu grew older, he became more patriotic towards America. However, America was not growing too fond of the new yellow peril coming to the country. Racial discrimination was rapidly spreading in America. Korematsu got a job as a shipwelder at the Oakland docks. As he went to punch in his time card, there was a notice from the union office saying he was fired because of his Japanese ancestry. On December 7, 1941, Korematsu knew that finding a job with a last name such as his was going to be quite impossible.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On December 7, 1941, the United States had officially declared war on Japan and Europe. President at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had another thought in his mind: espionage. He was fearful of Japanese-American spies and feeding the enemy nations information. The United States government had a difficult decision to make. Were they to prioritize public safety over individual rights? Were they going to violate the Constitution the United States was built on? The 14th Amendment says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." On February 19, 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military commanders to exclude people from military areas along the Pacific coast. The order did not specify a race that would be excluded. General John L. DeWitt, Western Defense Command, announced new curfews that only included Japanese Americans. From this moment on, there was a shift in the order. On March 27, 1942, Public Proclamation No. 4 stated that all people of Japanese ancestry would be evacuated from their homes and into camps within 48 hours. About 120,000 Japanese men, women, and children along the Pacific coast were detained and put away in assembly centers or relocation centers, better known as internment camps. Over half of these people were American citizens.
One of the big things was actually Japanese Americans came earlier and built the camp physically. So they They were carpenters and they built all these buildings.
Korematsu was going to do everything in his power to defy this order. He got a minor plastic surgery to change his eyes to look less Japanese. He changed his name to Clyde Sarah and told people he was of Spanish and Hawaiian descent. Unfortunately, his efforts were not enough. Korematsu was arrested on May 30th, 1942. While in jail, he was visited by Ernest Bissig. He asked Korematsu if he wanted to be a test case to challenge the government's order. On September 8th, 1942, Korematsu was convicted of violating military order under Executive Order 9066. He was sent to Tanforan Assembly Center to be held before going to a permanent camp. Eventually, Korematsu and his family were transferred to Topaz, Utah. Korematsu's case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court and ruled in a 6-3 decision, claiming that the order was a military necessity. The court for all time has validated the principle of racial discrimination. This principle then lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Korematsu's court case was a turning point in the grand scheme of the War Relocation Authority's internment camp plan. On December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court decision ex parte endo removed the WRA's power to incarcerate any Japanese American citizen and subject them to its leave procedure. Most of the Japanese Americans lost their property and businesses due to the failure to pay taxes. Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9742 on June 25, 1946. Truman's order liquidated the WRA. The loyalty questionnaire recognized 8,500 Japanese Americans as disloyal, and they remained at Toll Lake Center in California. This center was closed in March of 1946. The Japanese and Japanese Americans detained at these camps endured dehumanizing conditions. They were stripped of their homes, education, and privacy. Their civil rights were not protected and secured by their government. Once the Japanese and Japanese Americans were permitted to return home, many of the older generation were lost, and the suicide rates spiked 4 times higher than pre-war rates. The younger generation of the released detainees were troubled by the treatment of their people in the camps and their failure to speak up while detained. Sometimes America failed and suffered. Sometimes she made mistakes, great mistakes, but she always admitted them and tried to rectify all the injustice that flowed from them. The United States Congress paid reparations in excess of $38 million to the affected families in 1948. 40 years later, Public Law 100-383, better known as the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paid $20,000 in restitution and formal letters of apology to all living Japanese Americans who were detained. Korematsu's case was overturned on November 10th of 1983. In 2018, the Trump administration took up that loaded weapon, arguing both that its travel ban was necessary to secure our country and that the courts have no role in questioning that judgment. In upholding the Muslim travel ban, the court, just as it did in Korematsu, provided a rubber stamp to an egregious discrimination and affirmed the principle that the court should step aside when the government incants the phrase national security. Korematsu's case had a great legal impact because it was the first example of the law subjecting people based on their race. On January 15, 1998, Fred Korematsu won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award you could ever earn. In President Bill Clinton's speech, he notes Korematsu as a civil rights leader.
In the long history of our country's constant search for justice, some names of ordinary citizens stand for millions of souls. Plessy, Brown, Parks. To that distinguished list, today we add the name of Fred Korematsu.
Fred Korematsu died of respiratory failure on March 30th, 2005. In September of 2010, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger passed a law establishing that January 30th will be known as Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and Constitution. This day represents not only the heroic actions of Fred Korematsu, but the injustices the Japanese Americans were subjected to by their own nation.